Okay, let's get started. This is being recorded, as you can see, and we'll put it up on the YouTube section of the Pop Center website so that people will be able to watch this later and in posterity later on. So this is the NIH Grant Writing Workshop. We're going to take about 2 hours to do a deep overview of how an NIH grant works. And by the end of it, you should be able to start writing a specific aims, which is the first real step on the way to creating an NIH grant. And really the process is appropriate for any grant that you might be writing. It just so happens we'll be focusing on an NIH grant in particular. I'm a very big proponent of grants. I think that no matter what you do for a living, you will always have more control and more value to your organization if you bring in money, rather than if you rely on someone else to do that for you. And it just gives you a lot more control over your life. It's harder, but in the long run, it will serve you better. And so the goal of this workshop is really to, in general, encourage you to apply for an NIH grant or fellowship. And I do that by trying to take out some of the obscurity and mystery out of it. And I want to say also, if you have any questions, please feel free to interrupt. That's totally what I expect to have in this presentation. It's not meant to be just a straightforward talk, or it would have been a webinar, but no, I really want questions. And you can just interrupt and ask your question. Okay, so the basic overview of what I'm going to be of this particular workshop is I discuss how to choose an appropriate grant, how to contact the program officer who's in charge of that particular grant program, and I'll introduce the official NIH application packet, which is known as the SF24RNR, and also about developing the specific aims, which is kind of a one-page abstract of what your project is all about. We'll talk about writing the research strategy, which is the main proposal, and the bibliography that goes with it. We'll talk about human subjects, if that's relevant, and responsible conduct of research. Talk about budgets and key personnel, about your biosketch, letters of cooperation or reference, and other documents that appear regularly in the NIH grant applications. The project abstract summary, which is a 30-line statement. The project narrative, which is a 3-sentence statement. Resource sharing, which is about once you've collected all this data or whatever, what you're going to do with it, and benefiting larger communities and publics. Facilities and resources, about the resources of your institution that you draw to your grant. And then we'll take at the end a special look at the career development awards, the F's and the K's, as often as relevant for a particular group. It's a little bit of a subset of all grants. NIH grant applications are complex, as is the case with any organization that receives lots of grants or requires a certain standardization of information so they can easily compare them. I used to do applications for the electric and gas utilities, and they are also very complex applications for similar reasons. They just have different sort of side components. Regardless of that, all grant applications really have the same components. There are what I want to do, why it's important, why it's new, it can make a difference, improve things, how I'm going to do it and why I'm going to do it that way, how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost, and why I and my collaborators are qualified, and finally, while I'm in the right place institutionally because I have the right resources to pull off this project. And so when they evaluate your application, they're looking at these particular elements to see whether or not you are stating them well, and it looks like a believable, doable project for which you're capable of doing. I've seen, when I've sat in review panels, that is often how they look at it. It's like, well, can they really do this? Like, is it really feasible in the amount of time they say? And so you want to kind of look at all of that and make a good statement. Just as it is with articles that you submit, when you get the reviews back, a lot of times the issues around your reviews is you haven't spelled out what enough so that they can really follow what you're doing. And so that's true with grant proposals. You just need to spell it out, but you have page limitations with which to do it. And so you have to understand how to be succinct and clear and address the audience that you need to talk to, which is not just people in your particular peer group. So which grant do you choose? You choose the one that's appropriate for where you are at in your career, as well as how big or complex the research project is. So there's grants that are specific for graduate students. There are grants just for postdocs. There are grants for early career assistant professors. And there are grants for much more senior people. And so a graduate student would apply for an F31. If NSF has a dissertation award too. And those are, you know, you don't have to show that you're totally on top of it. It's a learning process. So they're going to, essentially the grant is a learning grant, a teaching grant. So it shows where you're going to accomplish that training. Postdocs are often in between. They're partly learning and partly independent research. Assistant professors tend to apply for research grants, but not the full, big, huge research grants because they just don't have enough experience under their belt to manage it or to really envision what that means. Whereas tenure professors are expected to write these much larger grants. The next question is, in terms of how big or complex is the research project itself? Are we talking about taking secondary data analysis like restricted HRS data for a unique problem? Or are we talking about like collecting brand new data and having several significant hypotheses that want to be tested? So you can imagine that a small grant might be an R03, which might be just a data analysis, kind of like an article, versus an R1, which is like, you know, 2 dissertations or so. One of my advisors said, you know, when he's talking about my dissertation, said, and what are you going to do for your next dissertation? Well, an R1 is kind of like your next dissertation. And then what's the topic of it? Which of the NIH institutes or centers, known as ICs, or other funder, you know, supports your area of research. So if you want to be interested in some aspect of mental health, then the National Institute of Mental Health makes sense. If you're interested in reproduction, then NICHD, National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, makes sense. Sometimes it's not clear, and it might be that 2 ICs might be potentially interested. And when you figure out which one or ones are the potential targets for your grant, then you have to figure out which program official within that IC actually manages the research most closely aligned with your interests. So all of that is sort of the beginning process that you take to start moving forward. Any questions? Okay. So examples, because I'm in the Berkeley Population Center and also work with CEDA, the Center for Economics and Demography of Aging. So the 2 that I work with most are NICHD and NIA, National Institute on Aging. And so if you were to follow these links, you would get to the kinds of research that they do. So let me just sort of quickly, let's see if I can do this. Can't go to that one. Let me go back here. Should have had this open, but I didn't. So here is this particular grant. And so I'm a demographer. I'm interested in population and dynamics. Here it's all about demography, reproduction health. Let's say I want to study migration. And so I look down, say which one of these looks like migration. Well, nothing directly, but I know demography and migration are part of it. And so I kind of might look at some interaction of this, or I can even do something like just search for migration and see how many times it appears. And here it is. So it might be an immigrant. Turns out I am actually looking at immigrant, some aspect of immigration and some aspect of health around it. But that's not quite what I want to do. Not quite clear to me. So then I decide, well, let me look at some of the other people that are in this. And see, it should have staff, and I'm looking for those staff. Go, grants, where is the staff part, adult? I know it. They do redo their sites every now and then, and it always throws me for a loop. Because I know I want to get to the staff people that are on here, and she's only one of them. Probably external staff. Here we go. Let's try this. So this lists the actual grants. That's not the one I want. Research programs, that's what I want. Okay, so now I have the P2B research programs and population composition, population mobility. Here's where's my migration topic. And the person I want to speak with is Regina Burris. So she's the program officer I've identified as the migration person that's in charge. So you saw it took me a little bit to find this, and I actually knew where I was going. What you have to do a little bit is to poke around the website till you find someone who seems to be working on your area. And you can look and see what her specific areas of interest are and see that mine will fit in somewhere into this group. So that's what you want to be able to identify the program officers. But let's say I was looking at immigration and mental health. Well, here's immigration. It might also relate to some demography of health aspect. That's Juanita Chen, right? But maybe I want to think about NIMH. So I would go over to the NIMH website and see if I found someone who's looking at population-related factors in mental health or migration and mental health. And then I would say, okay, now I have an idea of who I want to talk to. So that's why you get to know these websites. It does take a little bit of poking around. As I mentioned earlier, there are these seven, May
I ask the questions?
Please.
Currently I'm working on a mobile app that tries to help seniors stay connected with the community. I just wonder which organization would be better for me to apply for a grant?
What's the topic again?
Helping senior to stay connected with the community. Something like the social isolation, something like that.
Okay. So, and it's older adults?
Yep.
So NIA, probably NIA. However, social isolation could be a mental health aspect as well. So I'll talk about how to approach that when you write to the program officer. But in general, what you would do is you're going to be creating a specific aims, and then you're writing the program officer or officers, because you're not sure who it should go to, and say, here's my idea. Is it appropriate for your group or whatever group? And they will tell you who it's right for. So you don't necessarily have to do that guesswork, but you have to start off with the general target of where you want to go. But there's a bit of a negotiation in that.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for asking the question. So I talked a little bit about this, but there's different kinds of grants. There are sort of, with NIH, there are sort of the parent awards. So these are the ones where they're always kind of ongoing, and those are for all the different kinds of grants. And then there are specific target topics they're interested in. So now, as you might imagine, there's a bunch of COVID specific grants that are available. There are some that are specifically for Alzheimer's disease and related dementia. That's a big topic of NIA, for example, but not just NIA. Or maybe there's some aspect of isolation. There's one that I'm actually trying to develop on biosocial sciences. So looking actually at social networks and health outcomes. So there's all kinds of different sorts. And they operate at different sizes. These are the research grants. There are career grants, depending on what stage you're at. These are post-PhDs. There are fellowships for dissertation and postdocs. There's something called administrative supplements. There's separate kinds, but these where they kind of pony onto an existing grant. They're really cool because they take a lot less work and a lot less time to get awarded if they're successful. But you have to find something that has to exist for it. There's center grants. So the Pop Center and CETA are center grants. A PO1 is 3 or more R01s combined. So it's a pretty big, it's more challenging to do, but they're big grants. That's what you do when you're like a full professor. And there's training grants. So some of you may have been or are supported on T32 training grants, either at the pre-doc or at the postdoc level. So that is the department applies for, not an individual. And then there's programs which are also departmental or institutional, an R25. So you may know of our workshop in formal demography, that's an R25. It's a training program. So there's different kinds. Probably you guys would be more interested in either one of these smaller grants or in these career development awards initially. The R ones really are for tenured faculty. It's very hard to convince anyone that you're capable of pulling it off if you aren't a tenured faculty. All right. Another thing I always suggest doing is applying as a supporting researcher. So let's say somebody already has an R01 on your campus. They may have money. We have that with CenSoc, for example. CenSoc is a census, 1940 census and Social Security mortality death records project. And so if you have an interest in some aspect of that, and you can actually go to the professor and say, or the PI, the principal investigator, and say, hey, my research actually seems similar to what you're doing. And it could be they have money and could hire you as a researcher or as a postdoc or something like that for either short-term or long-term, usually short-term. I mean, and the grants themselves are short-term. So that's another possibility. The administrative supplements, pony up onto this as well. Or you write yourself into a PI's project. You say, PI, you and I both have this compatible interest. Maybe it's your dissertation advisor or someone else you've worked with. You have a good idea, but you don't really have the professional cred yet to be winning, and you don't know how to write a grant yet. You can collaborate on that, win a grant, and be supported by that. I did that on a project with Professor Claude Fisher here on campus, and it was a really good situation for me. Or you can write a training or center grant if you have the organizational skills. Again, you may not be able to do it on your own, but these are ways to get yourself, 5-year positions in a pretty good level, which is, I think, way better than being an extremely low paid lecturer, but that's me. They can be multiple, they can be collaborative or compatible goals themselves, but these are various strategies to get yourself a grant. All right. What about getting the grant itself? So first of all, I want to refer to a couple of things. One is there's this book, which I'm going to call The Book, which is a grant published by Grant Writers Central, and it's the Grant Writers Handbook. It's a really helpful book on how to learn how to write an NIH grant that was told to me by some professor that she said once she started using that book, she always got funded. I haven't been as good. I'm not her. And I think it's also gotten a lot harder in the last 10, 15 years to get a grant. But it is a really helpful way to understand how to approach this. You should always get a hold of someone else's grant application to model yours off of, a fairly recent one. You shouldn't try to write these from scratch in the same way. You should be able to look at what the structure looks like, how they present their content, and then you kind of tailor that to your own needs. That's the way to go about this. That's true with many other things. It's certainly true with this. The other thing is NIH has lots of manuals. They are thick manuals if you were to print them out. So there's sort of the general manual, which is about 300 pages. And there's another manual, this is like another 250 pages. There's a human subject specific manual, it's like 150 pages. So they have a lot of these manuals. I actually have read them. Do I remember them by heart? I'm going to say I read them. I also skimmed some sections, but the point is I needed to read this, so I need to know what was in there. But sometimes when you're writing the grant, you need to go to that section that relates to what you're doing. Let's say you're writing your human subject section. You go to the human subjects manual to make sure you're doing everything right. And so it is a kind of a time-consuming process, but on the other hand, you want to make sure that you're doing that dotting of your I's and crossing your T's that other people may not be doing, and it just makes your grant look much cleaner. So you're able to present your ideas in a way that's more effective and more complete than someone else who may not have read these manuals. So again, you don't have to read all like 1,000 pages of the manual, but there's some pages, the 5 pages that are relevant for your section. Yeah, you should read that section. That is definitely what you should do. All right, the overall process. First, you identify your research project, the topic, the scope, and you get some sort of you know, whether it's a long-term project, a short-term project, you get an idea of a rough budget, right? Is this a $50,000 project or a $3 million project, right? So to get some sort of sense of that. And where does it fit into your career? Then you find the funding source. We've been talking about that. Then you contact the program official and you send that person the specific aims, which we're going to talk about, and a few other details, which I'll talk about later. These grants take time. They're about 6 months to a year to develop and send and get in and hear about. As I said, you get a model, an example to model yours on. You need reviewers, just like an article, just like a dissertation chapter. You don't do them on your own. You need to get someone else who isn't you to read over it and find out whether it's clear. I heard one of my friends point out, says, do their brains start fuzzing out? Like, do they just space out on it? Well, then you haven't been clear, right? And they're not making the connections. So you want that. And then you need institutional support. You may be the PI, but you are not the applicant. The applicant at Berkeley is the Regents of the University of California. It is not you. You are essentially the hired hand to do the work. All right, you came up with the work, but you're still a hired hand. So all grants that go through the university must be submitted through the university when you apply, and that's through the sponsored projects office here on campus, but every university has some sort of sponsored projects office, whatever it is. Maybe it's called the Office of Sponsored Projects, you know, but everyone has that who does this kind of work. The overall process. Now let's go into another step of this overall process. You need, I would say, about 2 months to develop a grant, maybe 3, maybe 4. Depends what else you have going on in your life. They're often good summer projects, or, but you really need a certain amount of time. It takes a while for the turnaround a decision. Let's say it takes you, say, 4 months to develop and submit the grant for the deadline. Then it's another like 4 or 5 months till it's reviewed by the agency. And if it's a good score, then it's another 2 months or more till the funding is approved, and then a little bit more until you see the money. So it's really a year-long process. So it's something you have to plan for. It's not, generally speaking, oh man, I need some money next month. No, that's not going to work unless there's someone who has some money available for you. Let's say the Senso project where you can join in. The more you create your own, the more it's exactly your own. And the more you get money from someone else, the more you're more likely to essentially be a research assistant at whatever level of your profession on that project. So I'm senior, but I'm essentially a research assistant to the Senso project. It's not my project. I'm just joining in on it. But on other grants, it's been mine. I designed it and developed it. So then after you come with that, you just search for the funders. We just talked a little bit about that. We're going to do a grant, do other sort of looks. You read the FOA, the funding announcement, really carefully. You get a copy of someone else's similar application. We'll look at Project Reporter. You prepare the specific aims. You contact the program officers. You develop the draft budget. You work in shared services. That's your research administration organization to help you finalize the budget and get the application ready to be submitted. You don't actually submit it. Also, someone else pushes the button to actually submit it. That's through SPO. You get feedback in the grant design. You write your strategy. You get your internal reviews. You rewrite. You get another review. You edit. You write other documents. You get all this stuff submitted to shared services, our research administration, about a week before SPO's deadline, and they need it a week before it goes to NIH. So it's a logical process that you have to kind of stick to. But on the other hand, the advantage of this is it really breaks it up into pieces. So it's not one giant thing you do all in 1 week, you would die, but rather it's something that you go step by step. And some days, when I'm working on a grant, I'll write the easiest part because then I've been productive, at least I can say that piece is done. And so you always want to move forward. And that's kind of like a dissertation as well. I remember one day I wrote the first draft of my acknowledgements. I was going to have to write it anyhow. I mean, I was a year away from defending, but hey, I was productive that day. And so whatever it is you can do is what you want to do. All right. Using Project Reporter. This is a really important way to learn about certain things. So first of all, it's to see what else is done, including on campus, to find someone who might be working on a grant on campus, or someone you know through on another campus who's doing similar work that you could perhaps join in with. You can also see similar projects to see what's being funded, or what a summary abstract looks like. And you can use this to identify a project and then ask the PI for the application if you want to get an example, or someone you know or your advisor colleague knows, or sometimes just ask outright for the strategy. People will often give them to you. As one of my colleagues had pointed out, you actually could submit a Freedom of Information Act. All of the information is public record, but it seems like that would take time. So it's easier just to write to them and ask. So what's Project Reporter? See if I can go over here. Here it is. Project Reporter, which you can go Project Reporter, and it usually will find it, but technically it's reporter.nih.gov. So you can see they have all kinds of reports here, but really what you want to do is look at the active advanced project search. So let's say you want to see who has an F32 or F31. That's a pre-doc on campus. So I'm going to write the University of California. I don't know who the principal investigator, but I'm interested in NICHD, which is the, I'll say NIH because it's first, right? And then I have that. You actually can get more fields here. So I've added those. I'm going to do Berkeley because I just want Berkeley, right? And then I hit search, and there are two. Well, it's because this is first year and second year. There's Jenna Wells, who has one, Dementia Caregiving Ends, the Role of Patient Caregiving, Social Connection, and Caregivers' Health and Wellbeing. And you're going, well, gosh, that sounds similar to what I do. So you click on it, and now you have this wonderful example of the 30-line summary abstract. And you can get a sense of what that's all about. And also an example of the public health relevance statement. There are a million of these online, and you just have to find ones that are similar, but it'll give you a good idea of what's possible and how you would present your own. So there's lots and lots of abstracts. If you can click on the details, then you can see who the program official is, Melissa Gerald, and you could start thinking immediately she might be the kind of person you would approach if she's still working in that agency, which she probably is. Right? And then you also see how much they got for it. These are fairly standard awards, not a lot of flexibility in the budget. And so that'll give you a sense of what there is. There's no indirect cost. Oh, that's bizarre. There should be indirect cost, but what do I know? Okay, so that's a really useful tool for finding other grants that you might want to see that are like yours. And see, so here's someone on campus. If you wanted an example in F31, you could write to her and say, that people tend to be a little more concerned if you were doing something really similar. But if you were doing something that's just sort of kind of similar, but not really at all, then they're usually pretty amenable to providing their documents. And depending on what you're asking for, the very least you'd want is the research strategy. But for one of these career awards, you might want a bunch of the other documents because it's also really helpful to get the whole thing. And again, the budget on these things is set. So you're not like getting much of any, you're not getting personal salary data. There are the letters of recommendation. They're usually glowing, of course, but those might be considered a little more private. So that's the project reporter, really, really, really useful. Let's take a look at the funding announcement themselves. So this is the parent award for an R01. They all start PA, or that's how you know it's a parent award. The first thing you will see, I would have put the title first myself, but that's not what they did. It's called the NIH Project Grant Parent Award, Clinical Trial Not Allowed. They now have 3 versions of this, which is Clinical Trial Not Allowed, Clinical Trial Required, and Clinical Trial Optional. You can see whether or not it's been reissued. This is a reissue of, this is the most recent, but if I'd had the old one, it would have, as you can see here, it will say it's reissued as somewhere along the line, a lot of announcements to this, but somewhere in there, it would say reissued. I don't know where, they obviously have it here somewhere, but they have a lot of announcements on top of it. A lot happened since then because of COVID. So there's a gazillion responses to that. A lot of COVID related things, like what if you were in the middle of a face-to-face data collection project and COVID hits? Well, that stopped for a long time. So the NIH issued lots and lots and lots of announcements about how to handle COVID. But at any rate, you see the title. Here are all the agencies that are participating in it. Because this is apparent, it's a lot of them. There are some where there's simply a lot less. Maybe only 1 or 2 agencies that are interested, in which case it means it's a very limited scope that they're interested in. But if it's yours, you're in good shape. So then what you do, you will at some point read these, but you don't have to read these now. Is you look and see when is it due, standard dates apply. I'll go to that in a second. And then it scrolls down to really what it's all about. Now, again, this is a parent award, so basically anything works. So they're very not specific, but in other ones, they're much more specific. Then there's award information about budgets. Again, budgets are wide open, but some budgets say up to $150,000 a year in direct cost, period. That's it, done, right? Others say they're specific that only know IDC, the overhead cost is limited to like 8%. Here's the project period. That's another thing. Sometimes it's 5 years, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 1, right? So you have to look at that. So that's all kinds of information you start going for. And then later on, then you skip all that stuff. Eligibility might matter. Sometimes they'll say you have to be a US citizen or permanent resident. Sometimes they'll say foreign institutions may not apply or may apply. So there's certain things there. And then they'll go through a whole bunch of stuff. You kind of ignore that. That's not really relevant at the early stage. And you will go to the scoring criteria. And this again is standard, but other ones are more specific in terms of what they're actually looking for. But significance is it important? Is it advancing the field? It may be filling in a gap, but if it's a really minor gap, they may not care that much. So is it really filling an important gap that's going to make a change in how we approach subsequent research or how we understand the issue at hand? And so that's you need to explicitly state that. That's one of the areas that people get dinged on, and it's harder to recover from that. Investigators, that's, are they qualified? Your biosketch is one of the things that shows that. Innovation is also another critical component, which is this doing something new? Right? So new might be new data, new method, new subject population. Those are the typical, or a new hypothesis that hasn't been. What are you doing that's new and different? So that matters a lot. It does not matter for dissertation awards. The same, they're not evaluated on innovation. We do not expect pre-docs to be on top of the field. They're learning how to be on top of the field, but they're not there yet. Approach is really the methodological aspect of it. So you have a limited number of pages to say that you know what you're doing. So you don't want to get too much into the weeds, but what you want to convey is you've thought about it and you know how to do it, and you can, and it's doable, right? But what you don't want to convey is, I'll figure it out when I get the money, like that. And senior faculty are more likely to do this actually, because they're like, hey, I'm me. I'm like, Joe, big man on campus. So they're the ones that actually get hit by that more than sometimes some of the more junior people. Environment, when you're Berkeley or another top tier research institution, this is almost always scored perfectly. But basically, do you have the, libraries, labs, computers, blah, 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 whatever it is to pull this off. So if, for example, if you're working with restricted data, like restricted HRS data, so Berkeley has a cold room or non-networked computers with which we can meet the data security requirements. So you would put that into the grant. So they would know you actually could do it. And then human subjects, if there's human subjects, you really have to do that right. So here's the guidelines that you would click on. Remember I told you about the other document. Then there's other criteria. It used to be until I was in graduate school when NIH noticed that they needed to do medical research on women and children as well as men, particularly white men. Like almost all research for medicine was done on white men. And they were like, women do have different bodies, don't they? And so they started, so now you're required to be more aware of those things. And not just at one age, but other ages, and not just whites, but also non-white Americans. So a lot more diversity. In fact, one thing I've noticed, in particular, if you're on a review panel, the review panels themselves are diverse. And I have noticed that, the people that are of those minority groups, they are looking for that specifically, and they will call out if it's not articulated. So you really want to make sure that you do that. We don't work with vertebrate animals so much in social sciences, but you do, it's got its own, it's got animal subjects. You have to work with vertebrate animals in a way that's humane by NIH standards, maybe not by PETA standards. And then other sorts of things that come in, other details. This tends to be less relevant for going forward, but these couple of sections are really what you want to see and look at. You read that before you write to the program officer, because they want to know that you've actually done this, because otherwise you could be wasting their time, and they hate that because they get a lot of emails every day and a lot of people asking for their time. And when someone just hasn't even bothered to carefully read the FOA, it's not going to give you their good graces. Now, NIH, unlike NSF, NIH program officers do not make the decisions about reviewing the quality of the proposal. That's done by independent review panels, but they do make decisions about the funding of it. And so you kind of do want to make sure that you haven't offended them. They are your public servants, but they're also human beings. They are all scientists in their own rights. And so being respectful of them is also really a good idea. The NSF people actually do shepherd your grant through in a more active way and take a much more collaborative approach in how you get the proposal done. You may or may not feel that so much when you're writing it, but it is a little bit different of a detail. In addition to this particular workshop, I also recommend when you go to your professional meetings, if they have an NIH or NSF or RWJ or whatever meeting about submitting funding applications to those institutions, I highly recommend sitting in one of those sessions. They're very worthwhile. Okay, so that's that. Writing the program officer. Okay, so now you studied your award, the FOA, the funding announcement. You have started your specific aims document. You have a good draft of that, but you kind of know what your research project's about. And then you write to the program officer or officers, as we've talked about, and ask, your goal is really see, is it worthwhile for them, i.e. their agency? You want to get feedback on whether anyone's already doing this or how they might think about approaching it, and or redirect it to a more appropriate agency or program officer, which they will do. You want to keep your email to one screen. They get a lot of emails, right? So you want to be really clear, and you include the specific aims document, that one-page document. And if it's not in the aims in the body of your email, you might put in one of these details, but usually it should be in the specific aims, but not, the budget isn't in the specific games. So you might say we're looking, and you're really rough in here. You're not saying, you know, $252,042. You're saying it'll be about, I don't know, $200,000, $300,000, right? So it's a really rough budget. You mention the FOA name and number in the subject line, and you say why you think the topic is relevant, and you might mention any collaborators if you have them. With the F grants, you don't have collaborators, but you might mention who your mentors are. And so yeah, so that's what you do. Okay. All right, so let's take a deep breath for a moment. We're talking about writing to the program officer. I recommend that you go through the specific games first. We'll talk about that in a moment. And get that kind of nailed down. And that way they can see more clearly what you're doing. So it's not the first thing you do, it is as a subsequent thing that you're going to eventually do. But that person is the person you want to, if the person you end up finding out is the person you want, you need to talk to that person. Sometimes when I hear people, they're writing the grant, they haven't contacted the program officer, they're almost done writing the grant, they haven't contacted the program officer. They could be in for a rude surprise, like finding out that your topic has no priority at all whatsoever in the agency. And that's one of the things that's really important in looking at that agency website, what's important to them. And they even have a document which says, they give sort of the 1 or 2 or 3 year vision of where they're going. You know, NIA is interested in ADRD. NICHD is interested in reproductive health, particularly diversities in reproductive health. So you want to kind of look like what's important to them and make sure that you're actually thinking about that. It's not, you know, it's not that you're just going after the money, although listen, this is work. This is not charity that we're doing. We are professionals, but you want to make sure that when you're asking to have taxpayer dollars, that it's something that they've deemed that's beneficial for the taxpayers. So you kind of want to tailor your goals towards that. So just think about that in general. And you know, the application itself is complicated, as we'll go and look at, and it takes a little bit to kind of figure out. It's why you're in this workshop. I'm not telling you how to do it. Many other institutions, and perhaps we'll do one in the spring or in the summer, you actually go have a workshop where people meet, they share their specific games, they go through different documents, and you build the grant together. But this is just giving you the broad overview of what it will take. Okay, I'm gonna move forward to this in a minute. All right, documents required for most NIH applications, biosketches. So the biosketch is a sort of a version of your, Vita. It's not your Vita. Let me see if I can pull one off for me. I'll just show you mine from Senso, which I'm not totally wild about now, but you know what the heck. So what it is it's a standard form. You have to use this form and just this form, and you have to make sure it's at the right date. So see, this one expired 2020. It's an old one. So I'd have to update it. There, you go to the NIH website and you search for biosketch forms and you get the new one. It consists of listing where you got your education and what it was, right? And you have to have your ERA Commons ID, which is something you get through SPO. And then the first thing it starts off with your personal statement. This isn't just what you're about, but this is why what you're about, what you've done and how you got here is why you're appropriate for this specific grant. So I have one for every grant I'm involved in, because they have to be tailored to that. So this one's a mortality project. So I have to, deal with it from that point of view. So I talk about my background and aging across the life course, recent publications that are relevant, and what I'm planning on doing, and blah, 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 and why I'm relevant for this. I actually would rewrite this now, but it wasn't a high stakes one at the time. I was just being added to the already funded project, but it is a high stakes document in general. And so you really want to make sure your personal statement's a good one. It is not limited to a paragraph. It could be, I've seen a page and a half, but usually somewhere between half to a whole page is appropriate for a personal statement, depending on who you are, and to really state that you're selling yourself for this project. And that, so it is an important one. After that, you list your positions, you list, you know, your experience in professional memberships that you've done, any awards that you have and grants, you know, all those sorts of things. Then you have, this is one of the harder parts to write, is you talk about your contribution to science, which is what you've sort of sections of things that you've done. So for me, it's intergenerational relationships, geographic distance, Jewish demography. That's what, actually, that was my master's thesis. And more recently, Jewish deadheads, which I have to say, I just want to say as an aside. So I published this. It's not like any other work I've ever done. It's cultural demography. I put it in Journal of Popular Music Studies. No one ever is going to cite it. But so many people read this who are deadheads. It's so cool. Like lots and lots of deadheads read it. No academics read it. But I feel on that level it was a success. And then applied sociology. So those are my areas, and I bring forth at writing. It used to be you list grants, and now you only list them in the personal statement section and the grants that are relevant for that. So it would be present here. And so here I do mention this. I was funded here, blah, 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 and you know, whatever it is that I would say. So that's the personal the bio sketch. That you don't have to include this in the letter to the program officer. Letters of support.
May I ask a question?
Please.
If I don't have any contribution to science, what should I put?
You have to have some.
Oh.
So, you know, I once worked with someone who also said that I have nothing. But I looked at a CV and I created a bio sketch that looked pretty darn good. And the truth is, I mean, all right, so if you're a pre-doc, if you're a graduate student, are you a graduate student, Carrie?
Yeah, I'm a graduate student.
Okay, so they have a different bio sketch form, which, you know, I haven't looked at recently, but that actually could be it. Bio sketch career form. It might have, let me see, so see the beauty of learning how to, this is but this is a, wait, no, I don't want that one, stop. So here's a fellowship. So this is what one looks like. I'm gonna put it here, open it up, da, 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 da. So you see, you still have the personal, so you still have contributions to science. So here's what you would say. You would say more like what your interest is. But the other thing I would do actually, because forgive me, I don't know everything by heart. I would go actually look in the section in the manual and say, what do they expect to see? And the other thing is that you actually have examples. Where did that go? I think this is an example of one. So let's look at that, how they did it. So here's her personal statement. So look what she did, right? So, or he or whoever this was, right? So high school research, undergraduate research, right? I mean, you must have decided to go to graduate school for some reason, right? And maybe it was a class that you took and you published a paper, not published, but your paper, your term paper was on analyzing some data, right? Maybe it was something you did in your first year in graduate school. And maybe it was a paper presentation that you did at a conference. Those are things you're beginning. So what has taken you to where you are now is going to be your contribution to science. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's very helpful. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So you're not going to have a full-fledged, and it says up to 4 or 5, and you can see actually there's only 3 here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Hey, that happens, right? So there's only so much you can do. I mean, her honor is virtual, poster presenter is an honor. technically we wouldn't call that, I wouldn't call that an honor at my stage of the career, but at your stage, that's different, right? So we understand that. Everyone understands that. You only can be who you are, yeah, at the right level that you're at. So, right, and see how she starts, or I don't know if it's a she, I'm sorry, I'm saying it's a she, it is, right? I first became interested in human health and disease in high school, right? And then I did something else, and then I did something else. So it's not like, it's not going to be comparable to someone who already has their doctorate. It's a little bit different. Okay. Let's go back to my PowerPoint. All right, so the budgets I'm going to spend only a little bit of time on. It's just show you what it looks like. There are specific forms. This is what your research administrator does, but I have a document that I use that helps me figure out how much it's going to, about what it's going to be. So this is for a full grant. The career grants are much more constrained, especially the pre-docs. You have almost no choice at all. If there's a stipend, there's a percentage for tuition, and there's other research costs that are set by the agency, and you're done. So you don't have all of this to do with, but let's say you're doing a research grant, there's the PI salary. I put in the maximum here in my example, which at the time when I did this was $199,600. That may sound like a good salary. It is a good salary. It's a great salary. But most full professors at R1 institutions make more than that, or many of them make more than that. Particularly if they're economists or something. So it's the total amount they can actually claim. GSR fees, fee remissions, there's a fringe benefit calculation, and then you sum it up. Domestic travel, how do you calculate it? Airfare, conference registration fees, hotel for 3 nights, grant transportation, food. And you can just do is, don't always estimate on the high side, never on the low side. You can estimate for, in graduate school, we always shared rooms in conferences. But now I don't calculate that in the budget. I assume I'm not sharing a room, because at my stage, it's like, there's a couple people I'll share a room with. I have one colleague, we always share rooms. It's like the only time we get to spend real quality time together. But in general, I'd rather be by myself. You add it up, you add up any other charges, maybe there's money from another institution. And so this is a very more detailed one, but sometimes I just kind of say, oh, I don't know, 20,000 here, 10,000 there, 5,000 here, 8,000 there, and add it up. So it doesn't have to be all that specific at this stage of the game. That is done later on. Then there's something called a justification, which is they explain how you're spending the money. That sort of details later on. It's too much into the weeds right now. But the specific aims I really do want to look at a lot. I've already shown you some examples of the project summary and abstract. I think references are pretty clear. Appendices, in general, you can't do appendices, but if you do, there are a few things they allow, and a survey instrument is one of them. But they don't allow very much else. And if you include an appendix that is not allowed, they just return your application without review. And I've seen that happen to very, very, very large grants that took multiple people, many, many person months to do. So you really want to make sure you err on the side of caution is the rule on that one. Human subjects, that's a sort of a detail. Resource sharing is how you're going to share your data or your results. Conferences, you're going to make your stuff available on GitHub. You're going to submit it to ICPSR, whatever it is you're going to do. And facilities and resources, I'll show you an example of that for Berkeley. That's just what we have on campus. Cover letter, another discussion, not terribly involved. So I want to look mostly at this and this, the specific aims and the strategy. So let's go to...
May I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
For the human subject, do you mean I need to include the IRB or submit IRB?
That's a good question. So in protection of human subjects, so when you submit the application, you do not have to have the approved IRB yet. But before you get the award, the money, you do have to. So the usual rule of thumb is that you provide sort of the structure. You have a certain documentation you have to show as if you've done the IRB. So there's a lot of IRB work you have to do, but you don't need it approved. And you want to make sure there's no red flags. So let's say you want to interview people who have undergone sexual abuse. So many red flags in that. So with something like that, I would kind of get the IRB first. You're always going to amend it later on anyhow once it's started. But if it's something that red flaggy, I would kind of get the IRB first. But if you're going to do a survey or, you know, a basic, not highly sensitive data, you know, do focus groups, whatever, I wouldn't worry about it so much.
How about the research involved the use of the mobile application?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's okay too. It's fine. It's only when it's really going to get people hackled up that because it's hard to get the IRB. Not that, generally speaking, it's not hard to get an IRB. Well, I may not feel not hard because you always get the comments back and this and back and forth. But it's in the sense it's not hard that you're trying to do something that's so incredibly sensitive. Right. So getting an IRB for doing bio specimens is harder than doing a survey about attitudes and opinions. Right. And getting one about, you know, sexual abuse is way harder than just doing a cortisol check. So it's kind of like that. So if it's something where they're going to go, wait, you can't, that's going to be really hard to get approved. You might consider at least getting a support letter from the IRB, from CPHS saying, we have evaluated this and have these guidelines and we feel it will be approved or something like that. I would just kind of avoid the red flags, but yeah, that's the issue. But it doesn't, once you get the score and you see that the score is a good score and it's likely to be funded, step on it for getting that IRB approval done.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. So in this, I didn't quite want to do that. Let me shrink this down a little bit. 125%. Okay, so this is specific games from Stephanie Child, who did it for K99. So here's the overview of what it's about. This is the research question. It's justifying the research question. This is sort of talking about her, I want to be trained. So that's her first objective. And she wants to do this research on certain topics, right? And then she's going to use a certain data. So now you talk about the data and method here a little bit, right? So usually if it's not a training grant, you don't have this one here. You go straight into, in order to do this, I'm going to do blah, blah, blah. Here's the data, here's the method. And then you have aims, depending on how long the proposal is, it's 2 to 4 aims. It's not more than 4, it's not less than 2. Or it doesn't seem like it'll make sense to ask for funding. Well, you could do an administrative supplement with one aim, but and each one is different, but each one is required. Like you can't, each one should stand alone, and yet each one builds on each other. So it's an interesting balance of how you get them done. But you would, this format of bolding out what you want to do, what it is, and then explaining it out a little bit is important. So this is a document you want to have in general that you send to the program officer. I would say most people have anywhere from 5 to 10 versions of this before their final version. So it's something that is being modified frequently throughout the development of your proposal. So you're probably on version number 2 or 3 when you send it to the program officer. And you want to wrap it up with some sort of, this is why it's worthwhile to be funded. Like it will give me the skills, it will advance, some other aspect. With a regular research one, then not a training one, you will say why this meets the needs of the IC's mission. It's innovative, it's significant, and I'm well trained, and we really need to know this information, kind of thing. So that is, and time willing, I've often offered to take a look at this for people who have drafts, and I'll give comments on it. I don't know if Calvin's still on here. Calvin's still on here. So you may see that if you did that, if we're pursuing, I would do that for you when you do a final grant. Move forward. But that it's something you definitely want all feedback on, from your professors, from your colleagues, to see if it reads well and sounds clear. You know, it's going to go through iteration. So know that this doesn't get perfect the first time or even the second time. It just doesn't. Okay, then you want to write your research strategy. They tend to be 6 to 12 pages, 6 pages for most of them, 12 pages for the R1, and some of the very large grant applications that you wouldn't be doing at this stage of the game. And like there's some that are 25 pages, but usually when they're 25 pages, there's a lot, it's almost more like developing a curriculum and stating out administrative processes rather than an entire research proposal, like only research. And so, but this one's only research. So you have the significance, right? You start out with significance, you're spelling it out, use bolding if someone only were to read the bolding, they'd get all the important things about your proposal. I used to think the bolding could be somewhat distracting, but Will Dow in public health said, no, he uses that totally when he's a reviewer. So I'm like, okay, let's do it. So you want to be able to use this strategically to bring out what you want to say. She's also used a little bit of this, but you don't want to, of italics, but you don't want to overwhelm people with too much weird font. It's appropriate in some places, but not in others. Now, one thing I want to say about the strategy and the specific aims, the specific aims essentially is an abstract to your strategy. You kind of pull it out like an accordion in order to write your strategy. So you can repeat text in both if you want, that's okay. They don't have to be completely unique text. But the specific aim sort of says what it is all at once, and the strategy delineates out the details of it. The difference between the specific aims and the summary abstract, they sort of sound the same on some level. They're both abstracts. This is a one-page abstract, but we don't call it an abstract. And the other one says it's an abstract, it's a summary, and this is a summary, that's a summary. What's the difference? So the difference is the specific aims is to say what you're going to do, and the summary abstracts is to say more generally what it's about. Some people, I think, have too much duplicate language in them, and I think it's wasted real estate because very often the reviewers, there's people who vote on your proposal and they only read the specific aims in the summary abstract. So I don't think it's wise to duplicate the same language. There's a little bit of overlap because there's only so many ways you can say something, but to the extent possible, you want them to be complementary pieces to each other. I might mention something about the review process at this point, which is what happens in the review panel is that, first of all, they send out the abstracts, the summary abstracts, and only the summary abstracts, to a whole bunch of people who could potentially participate. And let's say I get like 25 of them, and then they say, evaluate. Can't do it all, maybe could do if needed to, and totally in my capability, given my knowledge. And so, excuse me. So I would check if I'm, can do one. And so let's say it's something that's about social networks and life course. So I'm going to say, yeah, I can do that. And let's say one, it's a biological experiment on mice and aging. And I'm going to go, I can't do that one. I get to the review session. I am one of the people who's creating detailed discussion about the one on social networks and aging. But when it comes to the one on mouse, I'm not doing a detailed, but someone else does. They present it to the group and then I vote on it. I've now only read, I have access to the entire proposal, but I don't read the entire proposal. I did that once. It's like, oh my God, it's too much work. So I only read the summary abstract and the specific aims, and I listen to what the other guy says, and then I vote. So that's why you want those two pieces are so important for the review process. That said, the strategy is important for the 3 people who really do read it. And again, you want to convey in your 6 pages or 12 pages that you know what you're doing and you know how to do it, and you're not waiting for the money to know how to do it. You know how to do it now. You have a plan, you have a map. So this is your roadmap to doing that project. If you're writing a dissertation award, then, you know, you're writing your proposal for your dissertation. Essentially, you might as well write the F-31 at the same time because you're doing the same thing. It's just going to be presented a little bit different, but it's the same thing. So why not? It's a really good strategy. Okay, so you have the significance, you spend time on that. Then you have a section on innovation. That's another whole section that you want to have. The significance is a half page to a page. The innovation is a half page to a page. And then you kind of have your background as well about what justifies your research. And that's kind of a rigor approach to it. Like, do you have a foundation from the body of research that has previously existed such that you're building on it and taking it to a new place? Now, I'm a demographer and a sociologist. That's what we learned in intro research when we were in graduate school. But a lot of groups didn't learn that the same way. And so they now require to spell it out differently on the NIH grants. But if you come from, you know, a lot of the social sciences, it's more or less how you do things anyhow. So it's not so crazy. But you want to sort of spell out you give the background that justifies why this research makes sense. You're engaged in that conversation with the existing literature. The approach section, which many people delineate by aim, she didn't here because this is a couple years old. This is like 6 years old. So it's not really the same reality of how you do them exactly now. But she 5 years old. So she lays out, this is what I'm going to do for each aim, how I'm going to do this. She creates a diagram. Here's the process I'm going to go about it to deal with each aspect of my research question about stress, about CVD, right? And then she talks about how she's going to collect the data. So here's aim 1, aim 2, sort of the hypotheses she's going to work with. So here's where you're saying, here's how I'm going to do each section. And you're not going into the details of the analysis and how your analytic technique works unless your analytic technique is in fact the revolutionary aspect of what you're going to do, right? But she's using mixed methods and estimating linear model. You know, like people know what that is, but she's saying what that is. You know, generally speaking, they like to see a more advanced methodology in quantitative research. I did see one review of a post-PhD, but not much past post-PhD grant proposal. And I think she was doing OLS and Logit, and they were not impressed by OLS and Logit, even though, I don't know, I thought it was okay, but hey, do something more. So, and then it goes through again, the next aim and the next aim, blah, blah, blah. And again, this is your specific aims, is this sort of outline. Here's the research timeline for how she's going to do it. Notice that it's a table. It's a really good way to present it. This may now actually be in the human subjects section, in a totally different part of the grant. You wouldn't have this here, but you would have this somewhere in there. Here's the training responsible conduct of research that she needs to have. If you're at Berkeley, or wherever it is yet, you want to get a copy of this from somebody else's grant at your same institution. There's only one way you can do this, a couple ways you can do this at Berkeley. There is the same Victoria Sharma who teaches it. It's not somebody else. Yeah, you may get the training and elsewhere in your classes, professors and blah, 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 but there's only so many ways you can write this. So why, you get this document and then you tweak it a certain way for your own particulars. So you don't have to totally rewrite. You get your letters of recommendation, blah, blah, blah. I wish I could go through this. Anyhow, that's the main point of this. There's all these other sections. I'm going to stop with that section. And it gets you through that. So what I say in the process is you kind of want to be all along working on your strategy. And every now and then you take aside and you structure in these other things to get them done. Human subjects is not as easy as it used to be. Maybe we'll have some time to look at that and see how it's done. But a very important section to do. All right, any questions on the research strategy or the aims or whatever? Carrie. Want to ask your question? Oh, no, you're just thumbing up, not raising hand. Okay, good. All right, excellent. Okay, specific aims, I talked about that. Again, really important. And so I actually, this handout's available on the Population Sciences website. Maybe before I get this out, I can put that link in there. But if you go to Population Sciences, to the grants section, there's an NIH section, and you will see this PowerPoint. It's from January, so the links are a little bit old, but not, there's only one link I had to change. And here's the outline for specific aims. It really helps you write it. I already showed this to you, so you have an idea. Project summary abstract. I already talked about this. And I have these examples. Here's the text that they actually give you to what their explanations are. And here's, they say you write it in the third person. Okay, some people do and some people don't. I have to say, one of the things that I find fascinating is there's a lot of rules and regulations about writing these things. Very few violations will disqualify your application. And really the only ones that will disqualify that I've seen is you claiming an appendix when there shouldn't be one, or submitting it to a program for which it's completely not relevant. And that's just not doing your homework. Like sending it off, saying it's about ADRD and sending it off to, I don't know, drug abuse, drug abuse, when it's really should have been a National Institute of Aging. Or there's a call for the program that says it can't be egocentric network and analysis, and you send an egocentric network analysis for the program. Well, just reject it. So, but I've seen people with the wrong biosketch format, with putting things in first person, with adding in something where it shouldn't have been, and it's flown. So I don't know, go figure. I think the reviewers don't notice it, and it doesn't really matter that much. There's only a few things that'll be flagged by the institution that will disqualify it. So don't usually sweat too much of the details, but some things really do matter. The section can't be 30 lines. Truth is, I don't even think it'll be accepted if it's more than 30 lines. I think the system will kick it out. It has to be the required font and margins. And, your research administrator should help you with that. And that is like, it can't be so small to read if they print it out. I don't know how many people print it out anymore. I really definitely use the exact, the increase in font size, but it used to be, there were only like 3 accepted fonts, 11 point or larger. Tables can be smaller than 11 point. Now it's like, they have a whole range, and they say it's so many characters per inch. So like Times Roman 11 point is too small, but 12 point is okay, but Arial 11 point is fine. I usually do it in Arial 11 point. That's the traditional one, whatever. Okay. Narrative is just 3 lines long. It's public facing again. It states the public health benefit and why it fits within the mission of the IC. So it's more like, at the end of this research project, we will know more about how signs of early decision-making degeneration can be created into tools to identify Alzheimer's at an earlier age and take proactive steps, right? So it's some public health benefit. Or you'll say that it aligns with the mission of the IC in some sort of way. So it's a very, this is why taxpayer dollars matter. That's kind of why taxpayers are going to benefit from it. So that's your logic there. It's not really just taxpayers. I mean, we do, they do fund research in other countries as well, but the idea is that research also benefits everybody in the United States on some level. If we understand, health risks in childhood pregnancies in Africa, then it still helps us understand reproduction in general. Yeah, and both the summary abstract and the project narrative are supposed to be written in layperson language, not 8th grade English, but but not so jargony that someone outside the field won't understand it. That said, you can go look at a lot of those examples in the project, in Project Reporter. There's a lot of examples. I have no clue what they're talking about. So it doesn't disqualify you, but you do run the risk of alienating other reviewers who don't know what you're talking about. So there it is. And here's some examples I have in that you can take a look at. I've talked about the research strategy a bit. One of the things that I didn't mention was potential pitfalls. So every research project, you have this sort of the vision of how you'd like it to go, but things don't always go that way. I don't think anyone could have anticipated COVID when they were, starting off a research project in 2019, but there's other things that you could say. Suppose you don't get the sample size you need. Suppose that that you thought your hypothesis was going to work a certain way. What happens if it doesn't? So you have to talk about what you can do with that. How to deal with missing values or whatever. There's some sort of how you look at that. So again, looking at other examples of what people did is a really good way to understand what pitfalls might be. And expected outcomes are another important section, which is once we finish the project, this is what we'll know, or this is what we'll have at our hands. We'll have this database, or we'll have this tool, or we'll have this diagnostic tool, or whatever it is, or we'll have a better understanding of our hypotheses, or whatever it is. We filled in the gap. So that's like a paragraph. It's not that long. Some people like to have that after each aim, and some people have it just as one section for the entire proposal. I'm agnostic about what makes sense. Okay, so this just gives you a little more detail about it. Moving along. And so I'm going to skip this a little bit. And I've talked about this also. Look, I'm rocking and rolling here. I just want to say again about the budget. Think of everything that could go into it. And if you're writing a research grant on, where the budget isn't limited to specific categories, everything that goes into it, salaries and benefits, fee remissions for the grad students. Some people I see forget that. Travel to do the work, attend conferences, flying collaborators. Like do you want to go to 2 conferences a year? And each one of them could cost like up to $2,000, $2,500. We're putting $5,000 for conferences and say which ones they are. You want that. Data collection costs, including incentives, including mailing costs. Oops, where did I go here? Of letters, of reminders, of whatever, newsletter event, something like that. Purchase of data, purchase of software licenses, your SaaS or Stata or whatever it is you use. Hardware, you need a computer for this. You need, Carrie, you mentioned about mobile data collection. So maybe you need to hand out, iPhones to a few people. Whatever supplies you need. Now, supplies and postage can only be for the data collection or something specific to the project. It can't be in general. That the overhead for the university pays for. And then you'll create this budget justification statement, which your RA will do for you to a large degree. Resource sharing. So a couple of places you share it, publications, presentations on the website. Maybe you include in the website, in the proposal, building a website. And, that might be, $5,000 for a simple WordPress one. And it might be $100,000 for one that has a detailed database and online analysis functionality, right? So it depends what you're actually asking for. You engage with community leaders. Let's say you're developing a diagnostic tool. Well, you might want to share that with people who would use that tool and bring them give presentations in their groups, not just your own little academic groups. You might put the data on the website, on yours, ICPSR, GitHub. You might teach workshops. You might do whatever it is to get it out there and whatever is appropriate. So with some projects, they will spell out in the FOA that you have to share the data. You definitely do with projects that are 500,000 K or more, but some other ones that are even less than 500,000, they'll still say you must put this in. You must have this aspect of it.
I have a question.
Yes.
So because I'm working on the mobile application, do I need to share share the mobile application features or the mobile app with the organization? I mean, the NIH or NIA.
So is it proprietary or is it open source or available? Are you purchasing? What's the story?
Oh, because I'm developing right now.
You're developing it?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's a really good question, Carrie. You know, there is a section on the application that says, is there anything proprietary in this application? It could be that you might be the kind of person who would check yes. You know, that's an offline question. I don't know the answer to that. That's like a new one for me.
Mm-hmm.
But it could be you might want to work with the intellectual property office and see about licensing and getting a patent for it. That might be a whole different direction of going. But once it's patented, then it's publicly available, right? So yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to that, but that would be something you'd want to figure out before you apply.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Okay, human subjects. Yeah, so I talked a little bit about this. Here's a document for reading up the details of it. You definitely want to look at this when you're writing your human subjects. So now, it used to be you just had like one document. Let me show you, and that was it. And you checked human subjects on another box in the application. But now they basically want in the application process a section which covers a lot of the information from your IRB application. So to some degree, you know, I mean, I said you don't need the IRB in advance, but you kind of sort of need a draft of it in advance. You don't need it approved in advance, but you need a good chunk of it if you're going to have a human subject because it goes into the application. So it used to be you only had, what I'm going to do here, it wasn't human subjects. If we can think of one that was, well, let me just try from examples. I don't think this is totally up. This is an old one, so it isn't how it is, but it used to be, you talk about subject population, potential risks and benefits, procedures for collecting, confidentiality. So this was just the one document you would have in there. That is not how it works now. Now it's a completely different reality. Let's see if I can show how that works. I can't remember if I use this one or that one. But now what you do is you go into part of the application process and you actually have to fill this out. And so you have the study title of your data collection project. And if you have more than one phase of data collection, let's say you have one for adults and one for children. So the adult one is a separate study record. Ooh, it doesn't do that. Study record. And the children one is another study record. So you have your title. You say, is it exempt? Yes or no? Probably not. If it's exemption, then you click that. Then you answer all these questions. If it's clinical, you have another whole big trouble. I don't know how to handle it. Sorry, we don't do clinical in my world. But if it is, there's way more to do. But if it isn't, then and clinical, it can get clinical really quick, actually. Right? Are you participants prospectively assigned to an intervention? So it could be that an RCT, it would be a clinical on that definition, as well as some kind of cash program. So it's always worthwhile to consider that. So anyhow, you have eligibility criteria. So this is something you have in your IRB application where you say who's going to be in it. It's going to be, men and women aged, 21 to 50, blah, blah, blah. Here's, white, black, green, purple, whatever it is, it has to go in here. Age, geography, et cetera. The minimum age comes in here. You include another document and another document and another document. So all these things have to be kind of done in advance in order to submit the application. So it actually requires a fair amount. I'm going to say an aside for Michelle, if we have pilot grants that have human subjects. We have to do this when we do the RPPR for the human subjects section for each of those pilots. We don't have any this year. I had like 4 or 5 or 6 last year. And each one of them takes, like, I know what I'm doing, and it takes me about 2 hours to do that, assuming I get the information from the PI. Maybe a little bit less. So you actually have a fair amount that you have to bring in there at that stage. So you really want to have written your IRB, a draft of your IRB, before you submit the application. Because all that goes into this whole section. And then at some point you stop. We only go down to like section 4.1 and then we're done. So that's just to give you an idea, but this is an online, you submit your application online in this thing called Assist. And you go, you upload your research strategy, you upload your biosketch, you upload your budget, you upload, you know, like all that happens. And then you also, if there's human subjects, then you have to go to this separate section and do that as well. So that's where you get a lot of help from the RA doing this, but the RA does not know how to do this human subject section. They cannot possibly do it by themselves. They just don't know enough unless you really structure the information for them. And so that's one of the reasons why people work with me in order to do that, because it's a kind of a learning curve. As it happened on campus, I was the first one to use this new Assist thing. And so when I was doing it, I documented it and shared it with all the other researchers that were, you know, or other research administrators, so we would know how to handle this, because it was all so new. And it took me 2.5 days to figure it out. Now I know what I'm doing, but oh my God, it was hard at first. But so if someone's figured it out, it's really helpful. And I actually have a guide on how to do it, and where in our IRB applications where the information comes from. Like this section, you go to section 3.6 of our IRB, and that is really helpful for us doing it here. So it's a little bit hard, but it can be done. It's just, you know, the IRB is not easy to do, but if you do a draft of it, it usually is sufficient for this application. I talked a little bit about the standardization of the, you know, bring in more information about human subjects and more information about children, women, and minorities. And so, because like I said, they used to only look at white men shamelessly, but that's what they did. All right. And this is the details about the human subjects. I have that in there. I'm going to skip this, but it basically is saying you're bringing children and adults. It's now called inclusion across the life course rather than children and minorities. And so and a child now is defined as someone who's under the age of 18. It used to be 21, right? You could be married and have 2 kids, but you would still a child in NIH's world, which was always amazing to me. But they changed that because they realized that was silly. And so that's another thing to address. And children require a whole different world, and if it's human subjects. But if it's not human subjects, let's say you're using like publicly accessible database, like then, you know, you still have to talk about children, that you're analyzing children in this thing. So regardless, even if it's not human subjects, it might not be analyzing children, but then you have to say that it's relevant, it's appropriate. Like, let's say you're studying dementia. Well, thank God, dementia is not a problem with children. So you wouldn't mention it there. Women, minorities, again, if you're talking about prostate cancer, you don't need to mention, women don't need to be in the study, but otherwise, you know, if you're talking about lung cancer, then they do. Target plan enrollment is another table about who's in your research plan. It's a table. Let me, if I can show you again an example. Let's see, I have an example section here. Otherwise, you would never know. So I do it in Excel, because then it's easy to dump into the Assist document, because then I format it the same way. This is actually an old format, and there's actually a new format, but it goes by female, male. Now they have unknown, Hispanic, like non-Hispanic, yes, Hispanic, other, we don't know who they are. And then these ethnicities or races. The only ethnicity we have is Hispanic now. I have to say, as a demographer, the more I go into this and the discussions we've had in some of our seminars, the more I'm beginning to think this is just insane. That the US has tried desperately to cram people into racial categories because of our history of having white, blacks, and Indians initially. And the world just isn't, it's just not that. And so, but this is what we have. So you get a table like this. And sometimes you get it from censuses, from the census representation. Sometimes it's because you know something already about your population because you have preliminary research, whatever it is, but you have to put this into the assist section when you do human subjects on this. And there's one. It looks like animals. We don't, like, I don't do animals. Equipment, though, that comes up every now and then, usually because we don't need equipment. It's a single piece of equipment, not a total value of the equipment. So if you need a whole bunch of laptops to do data collection and it adds up to $8,000, but each laptop is only $1,200, then no, you don't need to declare that as equipment. But if you have one, I don't know, gasonometer or whatever they call them, whatever, so then and that costs $8,000. So then, yeah, that's a piece of equipment, and that's different. And so you would include that separately. Facilities and resources, let me show you one. It includes all project sites. So if you're working with a nonprofit, you need to talk about the nonprofit. If you're working with another university, you have to have that in there. Even if the resource that you're stating is at your institution, it may be helpful to have a letter of support in your application. If you use anyone off campus, a consultant, another professor somewhere else who's just serving, you may need to include a letter. It really varies, but the letters often help. Some only in NSF, they often forbid them, but in NIH, usually they're helpful. You describe any resources in terms of offices, space, conferences, data collection equipment, computers, biospec, whatever it is, all that stuff you describe. Course releases require a letter from the dean or provost or whoever it is has that authority. Any additional financial support must have a letter saying they've agreed to it. When in doubt, provide a letter. Yeah, and so anyhow, that's the main thing. So let me show you what one looks like. I can actually go to a real application this time. Senso application. Let's do this one. Right, so here it is, still resources, UC Berkeley. We have no labs or clinical animals. Laboratory is kind of interesting. I've historically put that, but in fact, some people consider their computer lab a lab, so that would be a lab. All right, but he has offices, he's got access to everything. So does Dennis Finn. Here's the demography computing lab where we describe everything it can do. And then we have all kinds of technical staff, and it's got this, that, and the other thing. And sometimes we copy and paste too much, and we should have edited it down because it has stuff from another grant that isn't relevant for this grant. So you kind of got to pay attention to that. Here's high performance computing, libraries, UC data, whatever's we're going to throw at it. I will say I was once a reviewer on a large, oops, don't close all the grant, on a large, very large program. And they had so much in there. How did this end up being there? They had so much in their facilities and research. It was like 20 pages long. And we're like, how can they possibly coordinate all those resources? They can't. There was like no way. So it actually worked against them to have too much. In a way, it can work against you to have too little. So it has to be relevant. It has to be part of your actual program and not just thrown in there because you have it. I've definitely been guilty of just doing a little too much copy and pasting. So it's something to think about. Letters of support. So letters, yeah. So they have to be on their letterhead, signed, although it can be, one of those GIF signatures as well. And then PDF, because everything's PDF'd eventually. And it should say what they're going to do or what they've agreed to and be fairly specific. So if it's a course buyout for academic years 2018 2015 through 2020, one course buyout per academic year, right? So specific that way, or we're contributing $50,000 a year for the center, or I've agreed to provide this kind of, R training to the team, or whatever it is that they say that they're going to do. And if it's a collaborator, then they'll say, I'm going to be involved in designing the survey instrument, in analysis of the data, and co-authorship and publications, and I'm really delighted to be on this proposal titled blah, blah, blah with Professor Snarf. And I will be available in these years X, Y, and Z, which also, by the way, are the years that are stated in the proposal. So, and I have seen where someone didn't read carefully the letter of support and realized that what the letter writer offered and what the PI expected weren't in fact the same thing. And that became a problem later on. So make sure that you actually do read the letter. I do sometimes. I usually write some suggested text. Sometimes they don't modify the suggested text at all, and they all look exactly the same. So it's something to think about. You don't want it to look too much exactly the same, even if they have the same role, like serving on an advisory committee or something. So the letters of support and in the career grants, they are required in different ways. There's the letters from sponsors, your mentors, and then there's the letters from references, which are different. Okay, here's an example. There's that. Appendices, I've talked a bit about appendices. Make sure you read the most up-to-date, this is from 2017, which was up-to-date in January, allowances, but basically it's blank data collection forms, survey forms, questionnaire forms. But wait, no, you're not allowed that. Hold on. No, you are allowed. These are the only allowables. Simple list of question items, whatever. You're not allowed all kinds of other things. So make sure you don't, if it's not listed yes, then it's a no. That's pretty much how it works. Yeah, there are some things you can submit after the application was submitted. So for example, notification of you're getting a job or getting a promotion, and a relevant article that has been accepted for publication, I believe, are some of the things you can submit after the fact. We had some other things that made sense as well that I remember doing that we have submitted after the fact. And you talk to your program officer about that. Okay, now, oh my gosh, it's already 2:43. We only have 17 minutes left. So let's see what we can do here. This is material about these career. I've sort of talked about it in general, and I've already talked about project reporters. So we're doing pretty good. The NIH administrative supplements are very simple to do. Here's an example of one. They have newer ones. But this is to promote diversity in health-related research. This is to get at some of the targeted groups that are underrepresented in the labor force, which were in general Black, Hispanic, Native American, or Hawaiian, people with significant physical disabilities. So it's not like someone who's ADD, but more like someone who has cerebral palsy or blind or something like that. And also, so depending on the level of career, could include like first generation of college. First gen is usually more relevant for undergraduate than for postdoctoral, because if you've gotten that far, you've gotten that far. But it really varies a little bit. Being a minority group does not mean you're underrepresented, but so they have guidelines for what that means. And so anyhow, you can apply for these things. You look and find who has an R01 or an R20. It has to existing. It has to be, if you're applying for 2 years of support, then that grant needs to have 2 years left in it. Not including what's known as a no-cost extension, where you can get another year on a grant, but not ask for additional money. You're just using up the money you have left. But that doesn't count for it. It has to be within the initial project years. But like I said, it tends to be like a couple pages explaining what you're going to do, a bio sketch, a budget, and a budget justification, and that's it. and the support from the PI on that. And then it's turned in, it's dependent on how much money they have left in the year, and it's often turned around very quickly. You must have approval from the program officer to apply, which is different from regular grants. You don't need approval. I mean, I think it's advisable to get their feedback, crazy not to, but you don't need approval. But this, you need a letter of an actual letter of approval to apply. And there's some other grants that you need that too, but definitely in the administrative supplements. Okay, and I really push them because they're a great way to get money fairly quickly. So you just have to have your proposal, your research interests compatible with the scope of the parent project. Okay, all right, Career Development and Individual Training Awards. I've mentioned these already, the F31 pre-doc, the F32 postdoc. There's other postdoc versions. If you look back in my, in the weekly news, is anyone here not on the weekly news? Raise your hand, because you should be on the weekly news, even if you're not at Berkeley. Anybody? I can't see if that's it, if all I can see. All right, good. Oh, waiting, we have to get you on the weekly news. All right, so that has a lot of information. I recently sent out something from Maria Carranzas, who is the training officer at NIH, making distinction between who applies for an F32, K01, K99, or K22, or whatever. But it basically is a function of stage of your research. But these are training and career development awards. That means the priority of the award is actually your training and development, and the research project is really the case study. Sort of similar to your dissertation, right? Your dissertation essentially is also a case study in how to do research. It's also your deep dive into what's going to be your expertise as you launch yourself into your career, but it's not your expertise you continue the rest of your life. So this is really the training and development section. So they care, if you're a pre-doc, they care very much about the classes you're going to take, the conferences you're going to go to, the workshops you're going to do, whether you do an internship, like all those things they care about deeply. And oh, by the way, you should have a good research project that's going to allow you to get the substantive training and the methodological skills and other career development pieces that you need. That's really true with all of them. So you'll see there's a lot of sections that are relevant for that.
May I ask a question regarding training?
Mm-hmm.
And for the training, as a graduate student, what type of the training that I could apply? Is it only the K99 or R00? Are
you an American citizen or permanent resident?
I'm an American citizen.
Okay, good. Then you can apply to any of them. But if you're still in graduate school and working on your dissertation, then I would say only the F31. Also, well, you wouldn't be qualified for the F99. But but if you're close to the end of your graduate school time, you're finishing up your dissertation, then you should consider the F32 or the K99. And
because my program is only 11 months, so I will be graduate in May 2022.
Then you should apply for a F32 or a K99 or a K22. So the thing about those is what they are doing is saying they have sort of different scopes for who you are. Some of them, like the K22, you can only get awarded if you have an assistant professorship.
Oh.
You don't have to have it when you apply, but 9 months later, when they award the money, you better have one. So it's when you're going on the job market and you think you've got a good chance of getting a faculty position. That said, you can apply for this more or less the same grant sometimes to different grant vehicles. So you can apply more or less your K22 to a K99. Your K99 is 2 years of mentored research followed by a 3-year independent research project. you can only, so the K-99 is a postdoc. You can only get the ROO money, again, if you're in a faculty position or something like a faculty position. So I think like at Rand, a full-time researcher position would qualify, or, you know, but another postdoc wouldn't. And, you know, it can't be dependent upon your funding. It can't be dependent upon getting the K9, the ROO for getting hired. So if you know you're going to get a faculty position, then a K22 or K99 rule makes sense. Otherwise, an F32 is more open. And so that might be another way to go about it. That may be what you need to do, but it sounds like you should apply, you should be writing your proposal now and apply like in February or March, whenever the next deadline is.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's kind of subtle. The reason why I put that thing in the Weekly News from Maria Carranza is because I just didn't quite understand the distinction. And I spent a lot of time looking at this, and she really clarified it out just perfectly. It was so helpful. So an NIA is the only one I know that has a training officer, and her job is basically to help develop young scholars and get their careers off the ground with NIH funding. I don't know that anyone else has that, so it's really, really pretty cool. Yeah. All right, so that's a little bit different than I had a list for the regular grants, but this has a few other things. It has respective contributions, which is like a one-page thing on how you actually came to the point where you're going to develop this career. So that has to do with, you know, what research you did as an undergraduate and as a graduate student, and now you're like really thinking about it, and it led you, like I studied mice, and that got me into the biology of aging, and that got me into looking at senescence of cells, and that's how I got to this project today, you know. And so that's that kind of intellectual development. The selection of the sponsor institution is how you started, why you chose where you're at, you know, along the way, and why you want to be at that place. And that's because they have the programs, they have the faculty, you know, they have the resources, they have the connections. It's kind of, so it's not a facilities and resources thing. It's more like the totality of the academic environment makes sense for my career. You have the responsible conduct of research. I showed you a page of that. That's just like, and this is one of the things that's it's a up or down vote by the reviewers. I mean, you can correct it, but it's an up or down vote. And so it's better to have it right. And that's to make sure you have a good model of the right number of hours, in-face and online hours that are required. They've obviously, because of the pandemic, waived the face-to-face in recent years. But the assumption is it will be face-to-face again, please God, at some point in the not too distant future. Then you have something called goals. And that's kind of like a specific aims for your training and mentoring. It's like, I'm going to, like as a graduate student, so I'm going to take these courses. But even as a postdoc, you might say, I'm going to audit the class on causal modeling. I'm going to go to the summer workshop at ICPSR on blah, blah, blah. You know, so it would have some additional training. You're going to go to conferences, you're going to sit in sessions on certain things. So it's really, I'm going to learn how to, I know really well about social networks, but I know nothing about for egocentric, but now I want to expand to a different kind of modeling using this software, so that you put all that kind of in there and detail out what you're going to be learning. They want to see a trajectory of new skills and substantive knowledge that's going to build to your core and take you to your next stage in your research. And by next stage in the research, they don't mean, and I want to be a professor. They mean, I want to be able to research this new substantive area with these new skills. So I want to be able to someone who can do total network using SNA software, right? So it'd be a different level of accomplishment. Then you detail out these activities that you're planning. So it's kind of, I mean, like I showed you the timeline for data collection and the project, you also have a timeline for these classes and events and training and blah, 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 including RCR. And then you have this research experience statement that, you know, what you've done along the way that all shows that you are ripe for getting this grant. So it's a little bit different in process, but the neat thing about each one of these sections is that it's easy to get someone else's example and model yours on the example. So they're the kind of thing you could sit down and say, I'm going to spend 1 or 2 days on this for the good first solid draft. I'm going to spend another day on this, another day or 2 on this. And so you can chug them out pretty quickly, whereas the research strategy obviously is a much harder piece to write because it's, you know, it's that creative science type of thing. It's harder to do. You also get letters of reference. That's about, you know, kind of a more classic letter of reference as opposed to the sponsor and co-sponsor. You write this for them because they don't want to write it. But you write it in third person describing the sponsor, and then the sponsor edits it and revises, and it makes sure that it all aligns. You work, and this is, if you're a graduate student, this is your dissertation advisors or advisor. You can have multiple sponsors or co-sponsors. And the way it works is that the primary sponsor should be someone who has NIH grant awards under their belt, and also have proven mentoring of people at your status. So, so a full professor who's funded by NIH grants is going to, you know, at Berkeley is going to have that because they will for sure have mentored someone. If they have the NIH grant, then you're good. But you might want someone who knows the brand new methodology that the full professors don't know yet. This is something the assistant professors know because it's that cutting edge methodology or something. And so then you might want an assistant professor. So that would be a co-sponsor. And then it's more, they're coming aboard to give you that level of training that the main person can't do. And so you can have more than one, but these sort of more, these auxiliary sponsors don't have to have the NIH grant support, but the sponsor person does. So that's kind of where you're going there. There's more detail about the training plan that I've talked about. And okay, the sponsor strengths obviously it's been an NIH PI. They're well established in that field. So if you're studying dementia, this person should have published in the last 5 years on dementia. If it was like 15, 20 years ago and they haven't touched it since, or they've never really touched it, that's not a good person. That's just not the key sponsor person. That might be an okay auxiliary sponsor person, but if your major area of research is in A, then sponsor needs to be an expert in A. That's just how it works. Training record, they've mentored people. There's a good match of training and sponsor interest. You can have more than one sponsor, like I said. And and you want to be able to have a good relationship with that person as well. I mean, that's just true from a graduate student point of view. You want your mentors to be people that you can work with. And if you don't have a common language, that just might not work out. You probably should find someone else. And that's kind of true here as well. I mean, that's not a requirement for the grant, but it might help you succeed in the grant down the road. And so that's the main aspects of that. They should also be helpful in helping you review the grant application. And so if they're not helpful at that stage, they're not going to be helpful later on either. So that's something you need to know. I mean, there could be a temporary thing. They're on sabbatical, or they just had a baby or something, so there may be some sort of temporary reasons why they might not be present. But if they don't have those reasons and they're not helpful anyhow, then find someone else. The training plan, I got 1 more minute, but we have like 1 more page. The training plan needs to be clearly articulated, well integrated with overall aims in the research plan. It's coherent, well developed. It has multidisciplinary approaches. They really like that. And it has specific and ongoing training and responsible conduct of research. That's a requirement. They look for that. It's just sort of a separate pass through the proposal. All of that works really well. Obviously, the opposite of that are weaknesses. And just not enough detail. Again, like articles, you just haven't spelled it out clearly enough is usually the issue. And again, having people review it is what you want. And you know, people who get them credit their faculty for helping them or their colleagues for helping them write it and reviewing it. I just want to say you need to have an ORCID. Certainly for all fellowship and career, they're going to change it eventually for everybody else, but they haven't yet. So you should have one if you don't have one yet. And here's resources, and I am done. Oh, that's not what I want to do.
Just want to say thank you so much, Leora. This was so helpful, really well thought through, and really informative. Thanks so much.
And thank you.